All right, so welcome everybody to the Book and Nook. I'm so excited. This is now our third event of the year. We just opened in August. So happy to see all of you. And this is our first horror event. So I am really delighted to have the Hudson Valley writers of horror here. Yay. All of these five guys are just so talented, and I'm thrilled that they're here. And they'll do a panel discussion, and then after that we'll do a book signing. And yeah, so I'll hand it over to Dan.
Hi everybody, I'm Dan Volpe. I'm the author of all these books you see here. I've been writing professionally for about 3 years now. I've cranked out quite a few books, and I have no signs of stopping, and pretty much everything is horror. I grew up loving horror. I'm a horror kind of family. Dad used to work night shifts in a jail, and he'd always read Stephen King, and I'd come home, and his books would be sitting on the counter when I'd get up, so I'd always kind of see them, and that really started my love of it, and I've been writing ever since. Jason?
Yep, I'm Jason Gaylor, local author from Newburgh. Also writing horror for a long time. This is just a few of my books. My entry into horror was 8 years old when the babysitter went into another room and left me in charge of HBO. And American Werewolf in London came on, and I've been scarred ever since. But I love werewolves and horror, so that's where I am. I have 3 beautiful daughters, and on to Joseph.
I'm Joseph Bozzavano. I've been in the Hudson Valley since I was a kid, originally from Marlboro, living in Stony Point now. I'm a 90s kid, so I'm the product of Goosebumps, and I've been watching horror movies since I was probably 10 years old. So I started writing one back in 2021. 4 out right now, so yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Hi. Hello. I'm Chris Dillio. I've also been a Hudson Valley resident my whole life. I also, to go with what he was saying about the influence from your father, my father loved horror. He loved it so much he would decorate the lawn in the front with gravestones. You might have seen a couple of them outside the store here. And he actually had a carpenter build a full-size coffin for him to come out of so he could terrify the trick-or-treaters. And then he had shelves put in it so during the rest of the year he could keep his horror collection in there. So when he passed away when I was very young, I was 11, I started reading the books that were in that coffin kind of as a way to commune with him, and then found my way towards loving horror.
Hi, I'm Travis Lake, also Hudson Valley resident my whole life. Grew up in Walden, I live in Gardner now. I was terrified of horror when I was a kid. My sister was really into it. Her room was like a shrine to horror, and it kind of introduced me to it, and as I got older I got more into it. Also had an introduction with Goosebumps as well. I've been writing for a few years. Everything's self-published. These are just 2 of my titles. I still consider myself an aspiring writer. I'm still growing. I'm here mostly today to challenge myself. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so we have a little brief introduction from all of us. We just have a couple questions. I'm just going to kind of pick through some of the panelists just so we're not up here for hours, and let each of them just give, or some of them give their own perspective on some of these things. So I'll start with Joe. What inspired you exactly? I know you kind of touched on that in your intro.
I come from a film background, so I was originally, when I was younger, I would watch as many horror movies as I could. I went to film school. I originally wanted to be either a screenwriter or director, but I found that a lot of the stories I was writing are kind of limited on screen. You know, when you write a book, like, you can really write about a Tyrannosaurus Rex fighting a Transformer. You don't really need a budget for something like that, where obviously movies you need to write practically for what you're writing until you're, someone very, very big in Hollywood. So after I really found horror movies, I've started going to horror conventions, and horror conventions really just celebrates obsession and your fandom. And I think horror specifically is one of the most welcoming genres for really everyone. It invites a lot of people in LGBTQ. Really early on, it was very friendly to Just all communities really. So I think being surrounded by it really just makes me want to further my ideas and just put them out there as much as I can.
So I'm going to throw the next question to Jason. This is a question a lot of us get as authors. It's where do you come up with your ideas?
My ideas, they're everywhere, honestly. I was talking to you before, it's like you can find seeds anywhere for ideas. When I was talking to a high school class, there was one kid who worked in a brewery, another kid dressed in a Scooby-Doo outfit who did parkour, it was Spirit Week, and another girl who wore so much perfume that everyone choked in the room. So I created a story about the perfume turning everyone into zombies, the kid in the Scooby-Doo outfit parkouring, saving everyone. And the brewery was, I put the devil in a Starbucks, and they called him Stan, and he was upset they spelled his name wrong. So he made just evil images in the froths of coffee. But anywhere, honestly, movies, real life, you write about what you know. So sometimes I write about stuff, you know, in a cathartic way, or, you know, in a more fiction setting.
Yeah, that's one of the big things we get a lot as writers. People are like, where do you get your ideas? And sometimes, as much of a cop-out as this, sometimes this comes to you. Like I'll be driving and I'll be like, oh, that's a great idea. It's popping in my head, and I'll have literally an entire idea for a book. So, yeah, that's great. Like you said, picking off things through your life, through things you've heard. Music sometimes is influence. Like I listen to a lot of like screaming death metal and like really violent lyrics and stuff. So sometimes they'll trigger certain things in me, and I will come up with like, some of my books actually revolve around music. And I am not a musician at all. I'm not musically inclined, so I don't know where that comes from. Chris, who are your biggest influences in the horror genre?
Well, as I was
Besides
saying,
me.
Besides you, obviously. Well, when I go back to when I was 11, as I said, when my father passed away and I started reading his horror collection, one of the very first books I ever read was Stephen King's Cujo, because I saw he had the hardcover and it had, you know, this snarling face on it, and I read that, and from that moment on I remember reading that, just a graphic scene where the dog is, you know, ripping out the sheriff's guts or something, and I said, oh, I'm done reading Hardy Boys, and then I was in love from that moment on, and then that led to people like Dennis Etchinson, who is absolutely amazing because he can take grief and really put it in like just a fabulous horror spin on it. And then that also brought me into Matheson, who of course everybody knows. And then when they started in school actually teaching, you know, Edgar Allan Poe and Shirley Jackson, and then it just kind of goes, you know, one thing easily leads to the next from there.
Yeah, there's so many greats that came before us, and there's so much inspiration out there. All right, so for Mr. Lake there, what do you think is the scariest horror story of all time?
In my opinion, it's Pet Sematary.
Ooh, that's a good one.
I've always been a Stephen King fan. I mentioned before about my sister's room being a shrine to horror. She was a huge Stephen King fan and got me into it. And Pet Sematary is just, I always found it terrifying even before I had kids. Now that I have kids, it's even worse. So.
Yeah, that one definitely hits differently as you. Like I read that in high school, and then reading it as a parent, it's definitely something that is different. There's one here about writing rituals. I'll answer that because I don't have very specific writing rituals, but I do certain things almost every time. So I'm a morning writer for the most part. I get up at 5, like with Chris over here pretty much. He's up probably earlier than I am. And I write very early in the morning with 12 cups of black coffee, and if the dogs are making noise, I put my headphones in, and I will listen to either rain or fire. That's what I listen to, and I go on YouTube and I type in like burning fireplace, and it's just white noise, and it just blocks everything else out for me, and it kind of lets me focus. I can't listen to anything lyrical. If I listen to music at all, it can't be lyrical because that will start getting in my brain. So I have to listen to just kind of white noise. But I used to be a desk writer, but now I'm a couch writer, so it's a lot easier. I have a little lap desk that goes on. I sit there at my laptop and my headphones on and just crank away early in the morning. I'll bring this back to Joe. How do you handle writing about sensitive or taboo subjects in horror?
Well, like I was saying earlier, I think the horror genre welcomes a lot of minorities and minority groups. So when you're writing about something that's a little taboo, you kind of have more of a platform in the genre, because there's a lot of things that are traumatic when you're younger and even as an adult that are not necessarily catered to one type of person. You know, someone could be afraid of clowns, someone could be afraid of drowning, someone could be afraid of spiders. But I think the idea of welcoming something that's a little taboo will make you want to kind of open up and be vulnerable, so you can kind of channel that trauma and have like a character live out your trauma or live out that experience you may have had that you're writing about, that you're trying to get out of yourself. And I'm sorry. It makes it a little bit easier to scare someone else, to get that out of yourself. And sometimes those things aren't very friendly, and sometimes those things aren't very comfortable. So it's almost like a way of healing yourself, which can be taboo, if that makes sense. That was a little bit of a ramble, I'm sorry.
So that's actually a good transition.
Well, good information.
Because I'm going to ask this to Jason: is how do you balance suspense, gore, and psychological terror in your writing?
Oh, how do I balance it all? Good question. I balance it. If it's a fiction story, I like to. I write like you're watching a movie, so it's very fast paced with a lot of dialogue. So I like to bring balance through dialogue and get right to the point. And then I usually do a jump scare in the beginning, dialogue, another jump scare, and then a big finale usually. So through dialogue and fast-paced action, I usually do it. If I'm doing personal horror, then that's a little more cathartic. So
Yeah.
I'm walking a fine line on that one a little bit, but I try to still put my emotion into it and bring the reader into characters in my world.
Yeah, great. I mean, I always say that too, like story before substance. So some people like to just
Yep.
write torture and violence and just with nothing that has to do with the story. So story before substance for me is something that's always big. Like my books are for the most part very, very violent, very graphic, but there's always a storyline in there. It's not just there for no reason. It always propels the story. So I'll ask Chris, what sets your horror writing apart from others in the genre? You've been around for a while. You're a seasoned
That's a good question.
man.
That's actually that's a great question. It's really tough, I think. This is how I'm going to dodge this question. I think it's really difficult to try to find the way to stand out, especially the past couple of years. Horror is experiencing another one of its big booms. And then, like, I was at the Port Jervis Fall Festival, and lots of people were coming up, and every time I asked, oh, what type of horror do you like? People who had read horror, they always went back to Stephen King, and then I'd have to say, well which flavor of Stephen King kind of
Right.
thing? So you got to start with him, and then like filter down kind of thing. But so then I was using that as kind of a guide for my books. But I mean, I've had people say wonderful things, like give me praise in terms of like, oh, my book Devil Virus reminds them of Ramsey Campbell, or The Hands of Onan has kind of a Clive Barker-ish feel in terms of its sense of humor and its bodily horror. And then I think I really focus on a very psychological thing. For me, I have to be inside the character's head to experience everything, and I try to get that across on the page to make it kind of that very personalized experience. How's that for an answer?
It was a good answer.
It was very, very circumventing. And,
Yeah, skillfully done.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very skillfully done. Articulate. All right, so Mr. Lake there, how do you draw readers into your story and keep them engaged until the end? What's your hook? How do you hook people in?
I mean, it's hard to write anything purely original nowadays. I try to come up with interesting ideas that can go in different directions. These two books specifically are influenced by probably spending a little too much time on the internet and getting upset about kind of behaviors I saw, and there are criticisms of that, and I feel like that can bring people in if they feel the same way. And there's always an interesting story throughout. So it's just trying to find, I feel, your voice and your own original story throughout the tropes.
Absolutely. I'll take the last one, and then we'll open it up to you guys. If you guys have any questions. And the last question we had was, what advice would you give to aspiring horror writers? Just write. A lot of people will get hung up on trying to craft the most perfect book, and they sit there for years and years, and they'll keep writing, and they'll do 20 drafts of it. I'm not saying put out your first draft, but write it, get it finished, let it sit for a few weeks, read it with a fresh set of eyes, make your changes, get good trusted editors, and don't beat it up 12, 13 times, because you're just going to continue to change. Like, I can read my old books and I cringe because I'm like, oh, I would have changed this, I would have changed that, and I would have done this or that, but I'm like, I didn't, and the book is out, this is what it is. So just write. Don't think your first book's going to be a bestseller. It might be. You might be like Nick Roberts, who we know and love, is another indie author. Nick is a great guy, and his first book is blown up. He's done very well. Well, I think it's his second book, but it's early in his career, and he's done very, very well with it. And you can't expect that. A lot of guys, I'm sure these guys can tell you as well, you'll put out book after book, and you'll see very, very few sales. Maybe a few here or there on Amazon, maybe a few at a convention or a signing. Just stick with it. Stick with it. If I wrote my first book and I sold nothing, you would still see this entire table full because I wasn't going to stop. So just write, become a member of the community, read a lot, read. Don't just read your genre, read everything else. Like one of my most popular books is almost like historical fiction. It has to do with the Holocaust. Like, these are the gates of Auschwitz on the front of it. So it has to do with things that fascinated me. I'm a World War II kind of buff, so I like that stuff. So reading, writing, and just kind of stick with it. I'm going to open it up to you guys. If you guys have any questions for us, if you have a directed question for any of us, or if you have one that you'd like all of us to answer, feel free. This is your time to ask. If not, you guys can come up and take a look at what we have. So I'll leave it up to you guys. Any questions?
I have a couple.
Go ahead.
All right.
One is a group of nice young men here. Don't see a lot of women in horror. I would like to see more. I think we lead, live, and breathe a lot of horror in our lives, and I think it needs to go on to page. But in your experiences, I don't know, this is how I wanted to come in here fresh, not reading any of your books yet. How do you feel the scope of horror has changed? I would say, I'm not going to give away my age, but probably in the past 40 years, big turnaround in horror. I want to know to you what encapsulates a horror. Psychological, brutal, story over gore. I want to know for you, what do you consider like encapsulates a true horror story?
For me, something is horrific when it's just real enough to feel fake. Where like, this is so bad, but it could be real. Like I said, a lot of my books, and I do agree with you with the female perspective, probably 75% of my readers are female. We do have a lot of female writers. Like, we belong to, all of us actually, he has the books, showing the Books of Horror shirt. We are in the Books of Horror group on Facebook. We have a lot of female readers and writers on there.
Nice.
Some very good ones, and there are actually quite a few that are publishers, and they own their own companies as well. So they're a huge driving force. But for me, I try to write things that will reflect enough reality, but have enough of a kind of craziness to it that you're like, that could be real, but I know it's fiction. So
Okay.
definitely try with that.
Yeah, and some, I find a balance in my work where, for me, like personal trauma, I put into stories and characters, more of a cathartic way by design. Some, Like Contagion is just pure fiction that I just come up with and just write a rollicking good time. Jumping off what Daniel said, there are some fantastic women writers and publishers, and I'm actually fortunate enough to be invited to write for some of their anthologies, and they're just amazing women, worth checking out on Facebook and everything. And they're also in, like Daniel said, they're also in that group. So I try to find a nice balance, and also try to also make some strong female characters in some of my works as well to balance everything out.
Good.
There's one in this book who's a doctor, who's one of the main heroes, so to speak. So I try to find balance that way as well.
I think to some extent everyone goes through something traumatic in their life, or have had a general traumatic life. So I think really honing in on an experience you may have had, and a lot of the things I've just consumed, a lot of stories where someone went through something traumatic when they were younger, and then they go camping with their friends, and then through that childhood trauma, they have to survive the slasher in the woods, and that's how they make it out. So I really think that finding something that you can find pain through and then putting that into your work helps a lot, and people really can really read it on the page. As far as women in horror, there are a lot of women who have been coming out lately and writing a lot more, but I think right now women dominate the review world, and I can't speak on these guys' experience, but for me, when I'm on social media, 99% of the time there's a book review, it's by a woman. And even stuff of the extreme horror that can be brutal towards women are consuming, which I'm still like shocked by, intense. I won't speak on certain things because there's kids in the room, but certain acts against women are being consumed by women, and that's an anomaly to me, but it is happening, which is amazing, and they still want more of it. Like they're like,
actually
I just
giving
read
it rave reviews.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I just read this extreme horror about this terrible thing done to a woman. I want more from this author. On the flip side, they're the most critical about something. If a male author writes a female character, they're going to be the most critical about that. And I think overall, women read more. I looked up statistics like a few years ago, but like women read almost every genre more than men. I think men dominate like history because there's more like historians and history teachers that are male. So, but at the same time, through this review world, women are starting to write more, and then they already have that audience of reviewers, so they're launching quicker than a lot of the male authors. Like we could write 40 books, and then a woman comes and she wrote 2 books, and she has a much bigger audience. So like their numbers aren't there specifically for authors, but they have the bigger platform and they have the bigger network, which is really great, because we do still get to work together, because a guy writes a guy writes a book, and a woman's predominantly going to review it, and she's going to spread it through everyone, and we can reciprocate whenever she puts a book out.
Well, I think that what that brings up is what we were talking about briefly before, with the idea of how do you handle, right, because I think that was your question, how do you handle sensitive issues, right? And that becomes certainly a big thing, to go back to what you were saying, like the last 40 years, for example. And we just use King as the example because, right, he's the king, but there's plenty of work criticizing how he's depicted women, let's say, for example. And, you look at this table, and here we have, these white men, essentially, who have dominated in terms of writing, books, and then the way we depict women, and that's what kind of you were alluding to before about being, like, the reviews being critical, because it becomes a question of, all right, are you just objectifying these women, or are you always just talking about certain body parts they have, or are you treating people as human beings? So, to go to the other part of your question, like with horror will work for me any avenue, any subgenre, any of it. if I'm buying the character. If it sounds real, if the voice sounds real, if the motivation is there, if they respond to something in a realistic way, I'm willing to go with the journey. As long as I can, buy into everything, and I think it's a lot with the voice. And just briefly to mention something else too, I'm a high school English teacher, and I've been one for 20 years, and I see it all the time with my female students. And I have had some female students. I have one actually who graduated, I don't know, but 10 years, and I think she's on the cusp of being a professionally published author. But I've seen this happen many times with them, but they're so self-critical, and my wife can be the same way. Everything's got to be perfect. I've got to know everything about this topic before I write anything. And I don't know if that's universal across women or not. Or maybe just men, we're just like, I know 30% of this, whatever, I'll just jump in and we'll just do it and we'll see what happens. So it's like a more brazen thing. And so I spend a lot of time telling my students, specifically my female students, to be brave and to just do it and to believe in themselves and just go forth. And I think as that gets spread more and more, I think we'll see a lot more female authors in horror and all other kinds of genres that have been typically dominated by white males.
Something that I love about horror is that I really feel like there's something for everybody, even if you're not typically a horror fan. And I feel that opens up to a wider, bigger audience. And as Dan was saying, in the Books of Horror group, we do see there are many women authors in there, and lots of women who love to read this screwed up stuff. This book specifically is actually targeted towards women because it's a book about a bunch of toxic men being tortured and punished for the things they did to a woman. So I feel horror is very open and inclusive to a lot of groups, and I feel like it's always kind of been on the outside of being mainstream. So I think it's harder for people to get noticed, and so I think it's much more, especially harder for women to get noticed as well. In general. So I feel like that influences it, but there are many great horror novels by women.
Do you have another question, or does anybody else have any questions for us? Go ahead.
Is there any movies that have inspired you guys? And I don't even mean specifically horror movies. Has there ever been any kind of movie that's stayed with you and that's kind of comes back in and influences your work in any sort of way? Just for everyone.
Well, it's actually perfect timing because my aunt is back there, and that's my Aunt Kim. So my grandfather, who's passed away, what is it now? 6 years tomorrow. When I was 4 years old, he rented me Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street by accident. Because we had video stores for some of you that are younger, but we had video stores, and I didn't know what I was even getting, and he didn't have his glasses, or he didn't care. And I gave it to him, and he brought me home, and like any good grandparent in the 80s, put me downstairs, put the movie on for me, and it scared the crap out of me. But that kind of influenced me ever since. That's actually in my bio in my books. Was because of that kind of really started me. So definitely Nightmare on Elm Street for me was something that I'll always remember.
Okay, I'll go. As a film guy too, and writing Jaws stuck out with me because I like the Hitchcockian presence of the movie where you just see glimpses and then the big reveal at the end. So I like to write my stuff kind of in the same way. And I also did write a shark novel and kind of like paying homage to Jaws. And then American Werewolf in London. I just love the practical, scary effects, and I just still can't watch that movie to this day.
I would have to say Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think, I know it's inspired by a true serial killer, but with you really get like all the gross horror tropes in that. You get like the backwoods family, you get the slasher, you get the teens on a road trip, and it's really like I think it really moved me when I was younger because one, that's probably one of the worst situations you can be in, like watching all your friends, well, not watching, but like being the last survivor of all your friends and then barely making it out of that situation was something that always resonated with me. Even watching it recently, like that movie's rough. That movie's really bad, and that was 74. That's gonna be 50 next year. So that one definitely, and I think anyone who cuts off other people's faces and wears it just takes the cake for psychopaths.
That's great,
hobby.
because when I was 11, I saw Silence of the Lambs,
Yeah.
and he's got that in there.
I was thinking of that.
And that certainly made an indelible impression on me. But also Jaws. I rewatch Jaws every single summer, and the characterization is just
Yeah,
phenomenal.
And Three Men on a Boat just is so tight and
Oh yeah, no, it's
And-
perfect.
yeah.
And then when I must have been 10, my father was like, "Oh, I got a movie to show you," and he has me watch Evil Dead 2, and so that really shaped my mindset, because if Evil Dead 1 and Evil Dead 2 are very similar, except Evil Dead 2 is so crazy and over the top and wacky,
Right.
and it's just insane. It just keeps going, and I was really riveted by that whole thing. And I can remember being like, I can't believe that my father's letting me watch this right now.
I'm a huge horror movie buff, and I take influences from lots of different movies. With the werewolf vaccine, I had pretty much the transformation scene from American Werewolf in
Yeah.
London in my head the entire time. I also wrote a troll novel after watching Troll Hunter. It's nothing like that movie, but I was in a troll mood. So, but I take influences from a lot of different horror movies.
Go ahead.
You think satire has a place in horror?
Yeah, I mean, if you can't, like Chris said, like Evil Dead and, you know, some of those more, those over-the-top movies and stuff like that, and with all the satirical stuff that we see even nowadays, absolutely. There's so many different genres of horror and subgenres of horror. I mean, just between the five of us, you're going to get very, very different things. Even just to one of us, like some of my books are crazy, fantastical, and some are very serious, and I'm sure some of the guys down the line, same thing. Like, there's always going to be some difference in there. But yes, I think satire definitely.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I believe in that. One of my characters, Jeremiah Black, is very over the top, so I believe in being kind of like fantastical, like the villain with the great lines and stuff like that. And I also believe in, I guess I'm writing a lot more dark humor of late in my horror stories, so I think that has a place as well, at least for me. It's like well timed, like a comedian, you know, selling the soul to the devil to have the one last act to the audience, and they're all dead, and he's going to join them, type of thing. So dark humor has a place for my writing.
Yeah, I think that a villain that can kind of take joy and like make fun of a situation while they're doing terrible things really speaks more about their character. And I think that when they're very lighthearted about doing terrible things, it makes you really want to see them defeated at the end. I've always been a big fan of like absolutely hating the villain up until the point that they are defeated or killed. And I think making people a little bit more deranged makes that easier.
I think satire absolutely has a place. I have a book here, adult themed, that's about a writer who has a really bad case of onanistic behavior. So he engages in certain self-pleasuring behavior, and then he's hired by, or he's forced by his friend's wife to go rescue his friend from a cult in which it's a bunch of men all together, and all they do is pleasure themselves in the name of the ancient god Onan. And now what's really funny about this is when I wrote it, I was like, all right, this is ridiculous. No one's ever going to want to publish this. And I'm writing it, and I'm saying to myself, all right, this is crazy. But as I was going through scene by scene, and I'm doing it, character has to go here, character's facing this, and so on, I took it seriously. So the satire, for me, would be tough to do, like, right from the onset. But I think it can just come out naturally, because those are the things that you didn't know you wanted to talk about until it was too late and you had the book?
Well, both of these books are satirical, so obviously I believe that. This one especially goes way over the top and is just ridiculous about to touch on the subject matter. And there's really no limits to what horror can do, so going over the top and being satirical is just kind of part of it.
Yeah.
So it definitely fits in.
Anybody else have any questions?
I want to know what we're all afraid of. Oh, that's
Go
my
ahead.
first.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
The Hudson Valley is a pretty spooky place.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that's something that you incorporate into any of the
Good
work
question.
that you do.
I know I do for the most part. Like this book is set in Newburgh. I have Newburgh as a lot of places, even though I'm not from Newburgh, I'm from Port Jervis, but if you've been to Newburgh, it
Yeah.
can be quite scary.
I'm from Newburgh.
So yeah, especially if you're going down like, down Broadway there,
Oh, yeah.
off Broadway especially, it can be quite scary. So yeah, I do incorporate the Hudson Valley into there. I actually have in that book and a couple of them, I have a theater, like we know them, the Chance Theater, just closed up. My theater is called the Lucky Draw. So I always try to throw some Easter eggs in there for the Hudson Valley, and whenever I can, just kind of people that know me personally, when they read this stuff, they're like, oh, it's kind of funny, 'cause that's where you are.
Yeah, my stepdaughter went to the asylum by the Master College. Marist. That's torn down now, but she told me a story that was really creepy, so I put that in. And actually, one of my stories was born out of that one idea. Like, the doorknob won't open because it's like 400 pounds behind it, and I'm like, crystal doorknob. I'm like, oh, that's a great jumping off point. But I do put local flavor into my books as well, because I'm from Newburgh, so I have two good friends who are cops, so they're included in my books. The ferrymen, they bring criminal spirits to justice, so there's a big chase scene over the Mid-Hudson Bridge, or, stuff like that. So yeah, put some local flavor in there, because you're right about what you know. So if you need my two friends help power the story forward, because I know them so well and how they would interact. It's just kind of easy.
Hyde Cove is based on the town I grew up in, Marlborough, New York, and a lot of the characters are named after people I grew up with. Obviously exaggerated because there are some terrible people in here. And a story in Madman is actually about a hill in Marlborough, Bloom Street, and it's about a kid. He wants to ride down this hill. It's like this legendary massive hill, and along the way up, he's meeting all these ghosts that have died on the hill. Because I have always wanted to ride my bike down it, but I don't have the bravery to do that. But yeah, and even just driving around the Hudson Valley has always been so inspiring. I mean, it's such a beautiful area, and I lived in Brooklyn and Queens for 5 or 6 years, and when you have a setting that's so big, it's not scary. Like, if you hear about a shooting in a bad neighborhood, you're like, well, that's kind of expected. But when you hear about a shooting in a small town, you're like, that's terrifying. So the small town setting really just makes everything a lot more intense.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I teach in Marlborough, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But I grew up in Washingtonville, and so I have a lot of locale in here, and I have a book that actually I have copies of it, but Children of Fire, which is about a ex-detective who has to infiltrate a cult to save a child, and a lot of that takes place in Minnewaska. And so I definitely think actually I had created like a fake town, Warrenville, which was named after my father, and then it's occurring to me that I should just go direct, and because that's really just Washingtonville, so I should just embrace how I've been, growing up and really kind of go into it. But yes, I have those books about haunted Hudson Valley and all. I mean, there's more than enough to have everybody who lives in this area be horror writers. There's a lot.
I usually set my books in fictionalized towns, but I draw inspirations from the area. I believe it's this book. This town is Orange Grove, or Orange County, because I grew up in Orange County. I name another town I have in the book is Mohonk Valley. So I draw inspirations.
Anybody else have any questions?
I want to know what we're scared of. What are you scared of?
Yes, what are you scared of?
Like, probably the scariest thing to me now as an adult is probably losing my kids. Like, that scares me, obviously. So, I mean, if you want to know, like, physical things, like being probably buried alive would probably be the worst thing.
That would be terrible.
But I'd rather be buried alive than lose my kids. So, I do have, like, some grief things in these books. Like, in Left to You, if you guys know anything about the Holocaust and the way, you know, things went down, they separated families, and my main character in here is a male, and he has 2 twin sons. So if you know about like Block 11 and stuff, and Joseph Mengele, and when they get off the trains and they separate families, especially twins, that was very difficult for me, because I'm like, what would I do if they were taking my kids away from me? And you have these armed men there that are going to kill you if you do anything. So buried alive and losing my kids, definitely the two worst things for me.
I would kind of have to echo on that. Losing family or losing a child would probably be the most. I think drowning maybe for me would be a fear, because it's just quick and horrible.
Yeah.
But I used to be afraid of spiders, but then I realized that I could just squash them with my teeth. And, unless it's a big spider from like It or something.
Camel spiders.
Yeah. Then if it's spiders bigger than me, then yeah, that's a concern. But
I'm gonna have to go with big spiders. Anything like anything tarantula or bigger.
Yeah.
And then maybe like deep water. I remember it was big on the news several months ago about those people who were in that submarine.
Mm-hmm. No way.
Not for $1 billion.
Well, especially one made from paperclip.
Yeah.
Right.
But-
That's combining the buried alive thing and the people.
And the drowning.
Even on the most
And the drowning.
secure,
Oh,
even on
God.
like an army or like a military submarine.
So no submarine.
I would
Right,
never
that's
do
right.
that.
Yeah, definitely no
absolutely.
submarines.
For me, it's chaos and it's zealotry. Because I'm looking here, I got a book about a guy who's psychotic and chasing after a woman, and then I've got this cult that has these people who are embracing this psychotic religion, and then in this book, it's about anyone who dies on this particular suburban street comes back to life, and there's a woman who lives on that street, Sherry Matthews, who believes that this is an act of God, and so now she has to gather God's followers because that is what God would want, and she does some pretty crazy things to convince people that she knows the way, and I think that's the most horrifying thing, because the violent acts that all kinds of people do in the name of, I know absolutely, I am completely correct, can be pretty horrifying.
Is that Revival Road?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a great book.
Oh, thank you.
I'm gonna have to steal Dan's answer. Losing my kids
It is.
is just, yeah, anything happening to my kids is the worst.
Hence the pet
fear.
cemetery that you said
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah, definitely. I'm also very claustrophobic. I don't even like getting in elevators. So yeah, being buried alive would be.
Or in that submersible.
worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, that as well. I also don't like the
Terrible.
ocean. So yeah.
Oh,
It's easy to avoid.
yeah, oceans are easy to avoid.
All right.
Any other questions for these guys? No? Okay, well, first I want to say thank you to all of you. The answers were
Oh, thank you.
incredible. I'm so happy that we got to do a panel discussion. And now we will transition to doing a book signing. So each of them have, as they've been talking about, just fantastic books. So please ask them questions, look at what they have, and then if you're interested in buying any of them, I'm happy to help you with that. So, yeah. Thanks,
Do you want to
everyone.
put raffle books
Thank
on?
you.
Sure, yeah, so at the end, we'll do a raffle. So if you'd like, you can put, we have a little, like, a bowl thing there. So if you want to just put your name, phone number, or email address, yeah, you can win a selection of these really cool novels.
Very nice.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.